There is a notion that if Hitler didn't stop Army Group Center, it could have pushed all the way to Moscow. It was only maybe 100 miles away from Moscow. Is that a possibility? Because it had so much success in the early days pushing forward. Do you think it's possible that if Hitler, as we mentioned from a military blunder perspective, didn't make that blunder, that they could have defeated the Soviet Union right there and then?
Well, my own view is that they should never have got close. You know, Red Army has plenty of men to be able to see off anything that the Germans can do. The capture of Kiev, for example, in September 1941, was a catastrophe for the Soviet Union and should never have happened. I mean, Zhukov is saying to Stalin, "We got to pull back across the Dnieper." Stalin's going, "No, I can't possibly do that. You can't abandon Kiev. It's like third city in the Soviet Union. No way. No, absolutely not." And he goes, "Well, we are just going to be overwhelmed. We can't hold this." And he says, "Either back me or fire me, back me or sack me." So Stalin sacks him. Obviously, as we know, Zhukov gets rehabilitated in pretty quick order, and Stalin does learn very quickly thereafter to learn the lessons. But the opening phase of Barbarossa has been a catastrophe, and so as a consequence of Stalin refusing to let his men retreat back across the Dnieper, which is a substantial barrier and would have been very difficult for the Germans to overwhelm had they moved back in time. That's another kind of 700,000 men put in the bag. I mean, that's just staggering numbers. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things wrong with the Barbarossa plan. Too much over. It's just such a vast area. I mean, you're talking about kind of 2,500 miles or something. Of frontage. Maybe if you kind of put your panzer groups, which are these spearheads, and you put them all in one big thrust and just go hell for leather straight across on a kind of much more narrow front of, let's say, kind of 400 miles rather than 1,200, then they might have they might have just sort of burnt away straight through to Moscow.
They really caught the Red Army unprepared.
Yep.
Is there something to be said about the strategic genius of that, or was it just luck?
No, I don't think so. I think what's happened is you've had the Soviet purges of the second half of the 1930s, where they have executed or imprisoned 22,500 officers, of which 3 out of 5 marshals. God knows how many army commanders, et cetera, et cetera. So you've completely decapitated the Red Army in terms of its command structure.
So before that, would it be fair to say it was one of, if not the greatest army in the world?
Well, there was a lot of experience. There's a lot of experience there.
But also
that's for sure.
Technology, material.
Yeah.
The size of the army, the number of people that are mobilized.
Yeah, and they're the first people to kind of adapt, create airborne troops, for example. So yes, I think there is an argument to say that. But the decapitation is absolutely brutal. If you decapitate an army, you've then got to put new guys in charge. And someone who looks on paper like a half-decent peacetime commander might not be a very good wartime commander. They're different disciplines and different skills. And what comes to it, and you don't know that until you're tested. It's very hard to kind of judge. And of course, Stalin is existing in a sort of, a vacuum of paranoia and suspicion all the time, which is unhelpful when you're trying to develop a strong armed forces. So they go into Finland in back end of 1939, and they get there, they get really badly hammered. They do take about, to get the Karelia Peninsula, and they do take some ground, but at huge cost. I mean, the casualties are 5 times as bad as those of the Finns, and it's a humiliation. So Hitler sees that and thinks, okay, they're not up to much cop. Then Hitler loses the Battle of Britain, and he thinks, I can't afford to fight a war on 2 fronts. That's one of the reasons why Germany loses the war in 1914 to 18, is fighting on the Eastern Front, but also fighting on, the Western Front at the same time. We've got to avoid that. But I've got to get rid of Britain, and Britain hasn't come out of the fight. Britain is still fighting in the back end of 1940, having won the Battle of Britain. And so maybe I'll go into the Soviet Union now while the Red Army is still weak. We're not 100% ready ourselves, but let's hurry the whole thing forward. Because originally he'd been thinking of planning an operation in 1943 or 1944. So the idea is you take Poland out, you take out France and the Low Countries, you conquer most of Western Europe, you knock out Britain. So therefore, you don't have to worry so much about the United States because they're over the other side of the Atlantic. That then buys him the time to kind of rebuild up his strength for the all-out thrust on the Soviet Union. The failure to subdue Britain in 1940 changes all those plans and makes him think, actually, I'm going to go in early. And he's also been kind of, he's hoisted by his own petard because he starts to believe his own genius. Everyone told him that he wouldn't be able to beat France and the Low Countries. Everyone told him that it wouldn't work out when he went into Poland. Everyone was really nervous about it. Well, go hang you cautious, awful aristocratic Prussian generals. I'm the best at this. I've told you. I've shown you. I'm the genius. I can do it. He starts to believe his own hype, and of course, this is a problem. He's surrounded by sycophants and people who are constantly telling him that he's this incredible genius. So he starts to believe it, and he thinks everything is possible. And he's very much into this idea of the will of the German people. This is our destiny, and either will, as I say earlier on, it's the 1,000-year Reich or Armageddon, but momentum is with us, and we need to strike it. And only by gambling, only by being bold, will the Germans prevail, and all this kind of nonsense. And so that's why he goes into Soviet Union in June 1941 rather than a couple of or even 3 years later.
Yeah, he really hated the Prussian generals, huh?
Yeah, he hated them.